to in the wrestling business, and having a chance to work with Al is an opportunity that I'll never forget. But the thing is, Jericho was always an entertaining individual who was just so fun to watch, and also very unpredictable, who we never see enough of in WWE. Unpredictable characters is what I'm referring to, because we almost know what characters are going to do before they even do it themselves. Because if you watch wrestling almost 20 years like I have, in 1996 I started watching wrestling for the first time, and I can backtrack even further beyond 1996, and it was very predictable watching wrestling, and over 20 years, it became more predictable and more predictable and more predictable until we started seeing WCW alumni showing up in WWE and getting contracts like the Hurricane, Shane Helms, and of course Chris Jericho, who we had previously seen working in WCW down in the WCW power plant. It was not until then that we saw unpredictable characters showing up for the first time in WWE, and Chris Jericho was really the leader and the voice of unpredictable characters. He claimed that he had saved us all 16 years ago, and 16 years later he's coming back and claiming the same thing. One of the most memorable returns out of all the returns Jericho has made, because I know we've seen many of them over the years, was in December of 2007 when he returned with the torch carrier and he challenged Randy Orton for the WWE Championship and referred to Randy Orton as a robot champion. And then we had Chris Jericho versus Randy Orton, which ultimately set up for the return to the ring of JBL, who interfered in the match, costing Jericho the opportunity of the championship. But again, Chris Jericho serving his purpose very well. He was there to entertain us. He did in an over 20-minute promo saying he was going to take that title away from Randy Orton, and despite the interference by JBL, Chris Jericho versus Randy Orton for the title at that year's Armageddon pay-per-view was incredible, and it's a match that I still remember that I actually threw up in the video form of my website in the Imagery Center, Chris Jericho versus Randy Orton from Armageddon 2007, because Jericho really put Randy Orton over, as he has many wrestlers over the years. He would go on to feud with the likes of Shawn Michaels and Batista and do a great job pushing them, especially Shawn Michaels, who didn't need the push, but it was an awesome program. We saw everything from no-holds-barred matches, non-sanctioned street fights, ladder matches. Incredible, and it's all credited to Jericho, coming in and out all the time. Along with that, he promoted his band, of course, Fozzy, which are still doing a great job for themselves, of course, touring in the UK, and this is why we see Jericho go away on and off again. Sometimes he's there for a 6-month period of time, and then he's gone again, promoting things like Fozzy, who tour in the UK and different parts of the world like Canada and the United States. So obviously Jericho has other commitments outside of wrestling to fall back on if his wrestling career doesn't go the way that he wants to, and he wants to take some time off. But it's sometimes very frustrating, especially with how we don't see enough of unpredictable characters in WWE, knowing that Jericho's there for a short period of time, and in no time he's gone again, because I really wish Jericho would stay there for the long haul. I hope this time, which is why I hope that he keeps his promise to WWE fans. If he said 16 years ago he'd come to WWE to save us all, hopefully now, 16 years later, he's back to do the same thing. This also falls back on the number of injuries that we've seen this close to WrestleMania. Randy Orton, John Cena, Seth Rollins, Sin Cara, Sting, everybody's out with major injuries. Nikki Bella, can't forget about her when you're talking about divas. And now obviously Jericho is there to promote WWE and to put them over with all these injuries that have happened this close out of WrestleMania, which is something that you don't want to see. What is Jericho going to do this year at WrestleMania? If there was a Money in the Bank contract ladder match this year at WrestleMania, Jericho would probably be in that, but I see him surrounding himself with everything going on with AJ Styles, probably an Ultimate X match for all we know happening at WrestleMania between Chris Jericho and AJ Styles, because this program has been phenomenal, but he's going to have something to do with AJ Styles this year at WrestleMania. And if there was a Money in the Bank briefcase ladder match, which obviously there's not going to be until the MITV pay-per-view of 2016, which obviously AJ Styles and Jericho will be involved in, especially if it's an all-star Money in the Bank ladder match, Jericho's probably just going to have something to do with AJ Styles to follow up on Chris Jericho versus AJ Styles 1 and 2, which we've seen on recent editions of Raw and SmackDown, and the fallouts of events like the Royal Rumble and obviously Fastlane coming up. And it wouldn't surprise me none if Jericho and AJ Styles were in a match as early as Fastlane, of course setting the pace for WrestleMania 32, which really there's nothing being offered for, which is why Jericho's probably going to be headlining that show in some way or somehow. Jericho will find his way to WrestleMania 32. I'm really excited. On a scale of 5 stars, 4 to 5 is what I'm rating Jericho's return, because I've always been a big fan of Chris Jericho. It's just I find this Chris Jericho to be very watered down, very lackluster, if I can get away with saying that, because I remember him feuding with the likes of Shawn Michaels, as I just mentioned, even The Undertaker, Edge, Randy Orton, John Cena. I mean, those matches with John Cena alone, and the You're Fired match in the fall of SummerSlam '05, previously the championship match the night before at SummerSlam, incredible matches, an incredible program. I mean, Jericho just brought the best of not only himself, but everybody he worked with, and he was one of the driving forces behind all the pushes that we saw in the mid-thousands, and even the pushes that we're seeing now with the likes of Bray Wyatt and obviously AJ Styles, which is why his purpose now to me is more clear than it ever has been. Jericho's obviously back to guarantee them futures in WWE, especially with the overflow of talent that we are seeing coming in from brands like NXT and even companies that we have seen people like AJ Styles and Samoa Joe in before. Of course, referring to TNA Wrestling and even Ring of Honor names, who obviously are going to be getting deals down the road for WWE. So with these new wrestlers coming in all the time, WWE desperately needing to create stars, and I say desperately because of all the injuries that we have seen of John Cena and Randy Orton, obviously coming from being overworked all the time, and you don't want to see wrestlers like John Cena and Randy Orton being overworked all the time, because they're going to suffer the same fate as a Steve Austin or a Dwayne Johnson, who either retire because of injuries or just want time away from wrestling because of the physical toll and being pushed beyond their physical limits. So many wrestlers have retired, and you don't want to see the same kind of situation happen to John Cena or Randy Orton that just recently happened to Daniel Bryan, having to go on Twitter and announce his retirement after having found something in his brain, and then of course from all the concussions that Daniel Bryan had suffered from, he was forced to retire. Of course, last Monday and Thursday night on Raw and SmackDown, they celebrated the retirement of Daniel Bryan, very deservingly so, one of the biggest send-offs we have seen in years. But you don't want to see that happen for someone like John Cena and Randy Orton, because things like that are very unfortunate. And I can only feel for the Daniel Bryan fans and everybody else who has retired over the years, because you can't help but feel sympathetic for that. And you don't want to see people like Randy Orton and John Cena suffering that same fate. So you have to bring people like Chris Jericho back. There's really no other alternative when you're seeing all these retirements or people wanting time off from the ring. And I can understand why. It all has to do with being overworked, which obviously Daniel Bryan was. The same thing can be said about CM Punk, even Jericho over the years, obviously being overworked and wanting some time away from the ring to focus on things, other commitments he has outside of the ring with his band Fozzy, entertainment-wise. Jericho did say on the Road to Jericho Blu-ray and DVD release that it had been a remarkable 20 years that he had been involved with the wrestling business, so many people he had worked with, so many opportunities thrown his way. And who's going to argue that? Who's going to argue the fact that Jericho is possibly one of the greatest of all time, if not one of the greatest of all time? He's in the same category as a Bret Hart. Sure, Chris Jericho and Bret Hart never did have a one-on-one match either for WWE or WCW, but if it would have ever happened, it would have been an incredible match. And I believe at some house shows or some video footage that I may have seen of extreme rarity, Jericho and Bret Hart did wrestle, although they don't bring it up. I think they have wrestled, but it is in the record books that they have never wrestled before. And you always wonder, what would happen if something like Bret Hart versus Daniel Bryan ever happened, when you had two of the best technical wrestlers of both the past and the present colliding, and what would ever happen if Chris Jericho and Bret Hart ever went on a match between two technical-sounded legends in the professional wrestling business. It's just a shame we never did get a chance to see with how many people we saw Jericho work with. It's just a shame that we have never had the chance to see, and probably never will get the chance to see, Jericho work with so many legends that you would have expected him to have the chance to work with. But at least the programs with The Rock, John Cena, Randy Orton, Ric Flair, Rob Van Dam are all in there. And even Jericho's matches in the mid-card level against the mid-card wrestlers at the time, like Rob Van Dam and Jeff Hardy, were incredible. Just his matches with Rob Van Dam, Invasion 2001, that incredible, or the Unforgiven pay-per-view, that incredible ladder match that they had in September of 2001, just a couple of days before Stephanie McMahon's birthday, which she was involved in heavily. I mean, the exchange between Jericho and Rob Van Dam going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's a match that I don't think Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the hometown of Kurt Angle, the same night that he won the championship on in front of his hometown crowd in September of 2001. That's a match that I don't think the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania crowd are ever going to forget. I know that I haven't ever forgotten it about 13, 14 years after it's happened, and I don't think that anyone is ever going to forget that, especially those who witnessed it, because that exchange between Jericho and Rob Van Dam really put on a pedestal and put into perspective for me just how incredible of a wrestler Jericho is. And can you imagine if he applied that same kind of psychology that he has for years to people like Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose, and what he could do for them. That's where I think that wrestlers like Bray Wyatt really don't understand or grasp just how much working with someone like Chris Jericho really means to their careers. And maybe that is why they are so emotionally connected to their characters, maybe because they've learned from people like Jericho. And maybe it's oblivious to me that they actually do know how much it means. But to me it seems like people like Bray Wyatt and even people like AJ Styles don't know how much it means to work with a legend of the caliber of Chris Jericho, because before ever AJ Styles was a legend in professional wrestling, someone like a Chris Jericho was, getting his ass handed to him by people like Juventud Guerrero and Clarke, the chairman of World Championship Wrestling. Remember him? I think we all do. Ever before AJ Styles and Samoa Joe were legends, even Marcus Corvan, if you want to go back even further, were established names. Jericho was having his ass handed to him down in the WCW power plant. So I think that Jericho's name obviously has been established. It'll never be forgotten regardless of what way this goes for Jericho, or whatever way you're choosing to look at Jericho's return. I can tell you this, even though it doesn't seem like Jericho's going to be winning a major championship anytime soon, although it was teased a couple of years ago that he may have won the Intercontinental Championship when he was in a program with Wade Barrett over the Intercontinental title, although it may not seem like Jericho's going to be winning a major championship anytime soon, I am excited to see where this goes from here. And I think I speak for all of Chris Jericho's fans when I say that there's never been a more exciting time to be a fan of professional wrestling and a Jericho-holic. Just his catchphrases alone demonstrate great wrestling psychology, which I can't tell you how much I really appreciate, because when I get down to the wire about wrestling psychology and some of the greatest wrestling psychologists of all time, obviously Jake the Snake Roberts, Bret Hart, Roddy Piper are in those categories, The Undertaker. When you talk about great wrestling psychologists, Chris Jericho is at the top of the list. And when it comes to being the most entertaining wrestler on the microphone, how are you going to argue the fact or dispute the fact that Jericho could be one of the greatest of all time? I'm your host, Jonathan Clarke, and I will talk to you again next week. Like what you hear? Tell us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
And during the few moments that we have left, we want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here